Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We're delighted to have the distinguished Professor Sven Nyholm, grace Business Talk today, as our esteemed guest. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Sven Nyholm is a professor of ethics of artificial intelligence at University of Munich and principal investigator for AI ethics at the Munich Center for Machine Learning. His research sits at the intersection of applied ethics, philosophy of technology, and practical philosophy, with a particular focus on how AI and robotics reshape moral responsibility, human agency, and social institutions. He is the author of several books on Kantian ethics, human-robot interaction, technology ethics, and a just published volume on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And he served as the co-editor of the Journal of Science and Engineering Ethics. Before joining LMU Munich in 2023, he held academic positions at Utrecht University, Eindhoven University of Technology, and the University of Cologne, and earned his PhD in philosophy from the University of Michigan. His recent work engages questions ranging from algorithmic bias and responsibility gaps in autonomous systems to the long-term societal and existential stakes of advanced AI. In today's episode, we are truly privileged to sit down with Professor Sven Nyholm, who takes us on a fascinating journey deep into the heart of his compelling book, The Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, a Philosophical Introduction. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sven Nyholm to the conversation. Professor Sven, thank you for kindly accepting our invitation. It's a real honor and welcome you on Business Talk again.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program. It's nice to be back. We were just saying before we started recording, I was a year and a half ago since we last spoke. So nice to see you again.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, old philosophical questions about meaning in life, moral responsibility, and consciousness get new life in the age of AI in your book. If you had to pick one classic philosophical puzzle that AI has more radically transformed, which would it be, and how does AI change the way we should think about it today?
I'm actually tempted to bring something up that I mentioned the last time that you and I spoke a year and a half ago. And that is the very traditional philosophical question about what exactly is special about human beings. We like to think of ourselves as distinctive and different from animals, and different from the natural world, and so on and so forth. Some philosophers in the past have even compared us to gods rather than to animals. And so there has been this sense that human beings have had throughout the history of philosophy and religion, etc., that we're special somehow. And there's something about us that sets us apart. And one answer that a lot of people have given, whether it's Aristotle, whether it's Cicero, or more recent philosophers such as Philip Pettit and others, is the idea that, okay, we can use language. We communicate with one another using language. I mean, a couple of dogs might bark at each other and so on. And there are some animals that have rudimentary languages. But one thing that we like to think of ourselves, that we have sort of a special capacity for language that sets us apart from other beings and other animals, etc. Now, of course, with AI, with our large language models and AI chatbots that speak with us, that we can chat with, etc., that could be seen as sort of a challenge in this idea that that's something special about us human beings, that we can communicate with other humans using language. Now we can also talk not just with humans but also with AI chatbots. Of course, you have to ask, well, does it when we are talking with a chatbot, let's say, as opposed to when you and I are talking, is exactly the same thing going on? Well, probably not exactly. Nevertheless, because obviously, I mean, am I just trying to predict the next word that I'm going to say? Am I partly randomized? Am I partly fine-tuned, etc.? Have I been trained with reinforcement from human feedback? Well, actually, some people would say that probably some of those things is what's going on when I'm speaking with you. And indeed, actually, in every age, like, when machines came along, you had Rousseau and Hobbes discussing, are human beings a kind of machine? Rousseau saying not really, whereas Hobbes said, yeah, we are a kind of machine. Then the computers came along. You had some researchers and scientists saying, well, the brain is a kind of computer, the mind is a computer. And now we have AI, we have some scientists, some researchers saying, like, we are a little bit like large language models, whereas other people say, no, there's a deep difference between the way that we use language and the way that your chatbot uses it. But anyway, so this is a nice example, I think, of a sort of the fact that we now have talking computers that at least appear to be intelligent. You can discuss whether they're intelligent or not. That sort of challenges the way that we think about ourselves and what's unique about us as human beings.
Professor, you describe the book as exploring the basic concepts, values, and moral principles that shape contemporary human life in an AI-saturated world. For a thoughtful non-specialist, what three core ethical concepts from the book do you think they must understand to have a serious conversation about AI?
Well, it depends. I think so. When some people think about ethics, they think in a quite a narrow way. So they're mostly interested in should we permit certain kinds of technology? Should we ban other forms of technology? I mean, should we ban nuclear weapons? Should we ban certain kinds of AI? Should we stop the development of the most advanced models, etc.? That's a fairly narrow way of thinking about ethics. It's about, what can you permit and what should you forbid and what should you ban, what should you tolerate or allow. I like to think about ethics in a slightly broader way, thinking about what is well, going back to the previous question, what is it to be a human being? What is human life like? What's a good human life like? What do we want in life? And how does well, in this case, AI fit into that picture? And actually, I think in order to sort of identify three basic questions or concepts, rather, which is what you were asking about in your questions, you can go to the philosopher Susan Wolfe, who has a nice sort of tree of questions. She asks, so for anything, whether it's education, whether it's philosophy, whether it's, well, AI now, you can ask, does it make us happier? Does it make us into morally better people? And third, does it make our lives more meaningful or perhaps less meaningful? And I think, again, whether you're talking about education, whether you're talking about philosophy, or whether you're talking about AI, you can ask, for example, does AI actually make us happier? Does AI make us into morally better people? And does it make our lives more or less meaningful? So I think those are not the only three questions that you can sort of base a serious ethical discussion about AI on. But that's, if you want to take a sort of a broader approach than just the question of, okay, should we forbid certain kinds of AI? The UK government is about to forbid people under 18 to sort of have romantic relationships with chatbots, for example. That would be the more narrow question. The broader question here might be like, well, is it good to have a relationship with an AI chatbot? Can you even have a romantic relationship with a chatbot? Or is that some sort of confusion? Anyway, so those are some of the types of questions that I'm quite interested in my book and my research in general.
Professor, the book examines how AI affects moral responsibility, including responsibility gaps and shared agency. When AI systems participate in decision making, say in hiring, policing, or healthcare, how should we think about who is responsible when things go wrong? And does our traditional language of blame and accountability still work?
Well, I mean, there are two questions that always come up when people talk about new technology. One is exactly this question: who is responsible when something goes wrong? Another related question is, are we going to lose control over these technologies? And of course, those questions have a lot to do with each other. Uh, a lot of people keep saying that AI is getting more and more advanced, perhaps even more intelligent. Perhaps we've already reached some sort of artificial general intelligence. And well, with all of these developments, we're going to lose control over AI, or we're not going to understand how it works. It's a black box to us. If that's the case, and you think that responsibility is premised on control and the capacity to understand something, you might indeed think that, well, with more advanced forms of AI, the more unclear it becomes who's responsible if something goes wrong. Now, I agree we should be asking this question. I also think that we should sort of flip things around. Who is responsible when things go right? So let's say that I use generative AI to create art. Instead of composing a new song, I ask one of the models to generate a song in a certain style. Instead of writing my next, I mean, I have my book that you so kindly mentioned. I wrote it myself. It took a very long time I worked on it for a very long time. I had editors helping me, and I had colleagues giving me feedback. If instead I used generative AI to produce my next book, am I still responsible? Well, maybe if the book contains something offensive, maybe the generative AI model spat out some misinformation, perhaps even something racist or sexist or something like that, and yet I put my name on it, then maybe you will want to say, well, I'm responsible because I present this as my own work. I should have checked it more carefully. I should have been more careful. I was being negligent. However, if the book turns out to be quite good, that was generated by AI, do I deserve credit? Do I deserve recognition as being the author of this book? So I think we should talk about responsibility. We should ask who's to blame if something goes wrong, but we should also flip the question around and ask, whenever these tools deliver good results, are we then responsible, or do we maybe perhaps don't deserve credit for any good that comes out? I think that's a fascinating question. I spent quite a bit of time in the book talking about this issue as well.
Professor, you discuss control and value alignment problems not just as technical issues, but as ethical ones. Can you walk us through a concrete case where alignment is not simply about getting the objective function right, but about deep disagreements over which human values should be aligned with in the first place?
Yeah, and so indeed, control is another issue that always comes up. I actually think that we can go back to one of the examples that I already mentioned, namely, for example, people who say that they want to have relationships, perhaps romantic relationships, perhaps some sort of friendship with AI chatbots. Well, clearly, the UK government has decided that if you're below 18 years old, then you should not be having these relationships with AI chatbots. There are too many risks involved, and other people are saying, well, we shouldn't just apply that to 18-year-olds and below. We should also think maybe people in general maybe the chatbots should be so aligned that if people start saying, you're my partner, you're my boyfriend, my girlfriend, maybe even husband or wife or something like that. Perhaps the AI should respond, hey, hold on a second. I'm a language model. I'm a chatbot. We can't have a relationship. Others say, no, if people want to have relationships with AI chatbots, let's try to tune these models in such a way that they behave in a good way so that people learn how to have good relationships. And this is clearly a question about values. Like, what exactly do we value and want in relationships? Which kinds of entities do we think can deliver goods related to relationships? Does it have to be a human? Could it be an AI chatbot? Could it be a robot? I think that's a sort of a neat example of a case where you have to think philosophically about what we value in a relationship, and with what sort of entities or people or animals or whatever it might be can we have these kinds of relationships, and that would be a value alignment question that is not purely technical, but clearly also a question of values and what matters in life.
Professor, your book explicitly tackles puzzles about generative AI and authorship. In a world where AI can produce convincing text, images, and music, what kind of authorship model do you find most plausible? Are these systems tools, co-authors, ghostwriters, or something else entirely? And how should that matter ethically and legally?
Yeah, indeed, that's a key question. One that I'm currently writing yet another book, which is only about this topic. So I'm really thinking about this issue at the moment. Not least because I'm a professor at a university, and my students, they hand in essays, and I always am asking myself, was this written by the student, or was it AI generated? Some sort of mix, perhaps partly AI generated, perhaps partly written by the student. Is there some sort of limit or boundary or threshold so that such that if so much AI has been used, the student is not really the author anymore of the paper? Of course, if I give them an assignment, they just put the assignment in as a prompt, they copy and paste whatever comes out of the chatbot, and they hand that in as a student essay. Most professors or most teachers would say, well, that we didn't learn anything about what the student knows or doesn't know, because we just learned what the chatbot said. So they're not really the author in the sense that they deserve a good or perhaps a bad grade, perhaps no grade. So there clearly has to be some involvement, some active thinking, creativity on part of whoever's using these tools. On the other hand, of course, there are also artists these days who do sort of extensive prompting and reprompting, and sort of working on, for example, images over time and changing them, and then finding that sweet spot where they're sort of happy with the result. There, you would probably want to say that they are, in some sense, the artists or the authors behind those images. So it's very hard to sort of find some sort of balance here between we have a text or an image or a piece of music without an author, or where the AI itself may be the ghost author, as you say. On the other hand, and when we would be happy to say that someone's the author. I actually think that we sometimes talk about driverless cars as another word for self-driving car. I mean, we should maybe also talk about authorless texts or parts of texts. If something is too AI generated, then perhaps no one lives up to the requirements or the criteria that we associate with being an author. Going back to the issue of responsibility, perhaps the person can be held accountable for any problems that they cause with what they created with AI. But if it's good, to return to that issue, maybe they don't just deserve recognition or credit. Maybe they should not be paid royalties, etc. So I think, as you also indicate, we have to update and change the way we think about authorship when people use these tools. Of course, if you still do what I did when I wrote my book, I wrote it in an old school way. I don't think we have to worry about authorship issues then. But given that people are using these tools more and more, we have to rethink these issues. Maybe we should be inspired by something like, for example, hip hop music. When hip hop came along, some people said, well, you're not composing music, you're sampling other people's music. You're not really singing in a traditional way, you're rapping, and you're not really playing instruments, you're sort of using turntables and so on. And then some of the hip hop artists said, okay, fine. Instead of calling us composers, call us producers. Instead of calling us, this, call us that, etc. So that might be an example of sort of a cultural development that could serve as a sort of a model for how to think about authorship in the age of generative AI.
Professor also discuss AI imitations of living or dead people, deepfakes, voice clones, digital doubles. What ethical framework do you propose for deciding when such imitations are acceptable? And is there any domain, grief technologies, politics, education, where you think we should draw especially firm lines?
Yeah, and this is really something that has been exploding in the last few years as a topic, because the CEO of Zoom, for example, thinks that we should have the option of having a Zoom twin that could join some of the meetings so that we don't have to take all Zoom calls. And in the entertainment world, the American country singer Randy Travis had a stroke, but then released a new song under his own name that was AI generated in part. ABBA, the Swedish music group, they are performing as Avatar, or as avatars, as they call them, in London. And there are all sorts of AI and digital imitations of people. You also mentioned grief. There's some companies that are offering the service that if your loved ones have died, they can come back as a chatbot, and you can talk with a chatbot that sort of imitates them. And as you think about these different areas of possible uses, whether it's entertainment, handling grief, and there was another case in America where a person had been murdered, but then at the murder trial, a man, I think Chris Pelkey was his name, if I recall correctly, he made an appearance at the trial in the form of an AI avatar, and spoke about how he felt about his murderer, so to speak. And the judge in that case allowed that. I think that's one of those kind of cases where you might think, well, maybe we shouldn't have AI imitations. Maybe in criminal trials, there should only be real witnesses, real people there giving testimony, and not AI imitations. Whereas if it's about entertainment and everyone is informed beforehand, okay, you're going to be hearing a song that's AI generated. I personally am not interested in AI music. I want to hear real music by real musicians, so to speak. But if I'm told beforehand this is AI, I'm not going to have an ethical, well, maybe sometimes, but a lot of the time that's okay. I mean, it's not my thing. But however, when it comes to a murder trial or something like that, you might say, here we draw the line. We're going to have a real person or nothing. Because I mean, any AI imitation is always a model of a person. It's an approximation. It's an attempt to recreate. It's not the actual person. And even though we may be partly predictable as human beings, I mean, as I mentioned, I actually used the same example at the beginning of the interview that I did the last time we spoke. Nevertheless, we sometimes also do unexpected things. And so we shouldn't think of ourselves as sort of predictable, patterns of information flow. We think of each other as agents with free will who are responsible for what we do. And in those kinds of situations where it really matters what you choose to do, it should be you and not an AI imitation of you who, testifies at a trial or whatever it might be.
Professor, the book raises the possibility of artificial consciousness as one of its central topics. Even if we remain agnostic about whether current systems are conscious, what kind of philosophical mistake do you see people making when they talk about conscious AI? And what would ethically follow if we ever had good reason to think some AI systems really were conscious?
Yeah, I mean, one fascinating thing is that all sorts of different kinds of people are thinking that AI might already be conscious, uh, including scientists, including researchers, including AI experts. Jeffrey Hinton, who received a Nobel Prize 2 years ago, I guess it was, for his work in AI research, he has claimed that chatbots are conscious or sentient. The famous researcher Richard Dawkins, who has argued that people who believe in God are suffering from some sort of illusion, has recently argued that Claude, or as he calls it, Claudia, the chatbot from Anthropic, is conscious. Why does he think that? Because he had long discussions and he thought that the answers that came from the chatbot must emanate from a mind, a conscious mind. Of course, a lot of critics said that, well, actually, what you said that religious people were doing, attributing agency to natural environment, etc., where there's no actual agency, you are now doing the same thing to a chatbot. So, I mean, and I do think that that's a kind of mistake. We shouldn't go from I'm talking with the chatbot and it says that it's conscious, it speaks as if it's conscious, to therefore necessarily it is conscious. When we interact with our fellow humans, I mean, we typically explain, why did you say what you said? Well, I mean, maybe because you're tired, maybe because you're energized, but because you're happy, because you're sad. And we ask each other how you're feeling. I'm feeling well today. Thank you very much. How about yourself, etc. And then, we have a kind of duty to sort of trust each other to some extent, and also to be honest with one another. When, however, we speak with a chatbot, we don't think that it produces the output because it's in a certain conscious state. We think that, well, it's a model, it's been fine-tuned, it's been trained, it's trying to reproduce patterns in the training data. And of course, in the training data, you have people talking about their feelings, they're talking about their conscious states. And so obviously the chatbot is going to produce outputs that would use the same terms that we use. But you would explain the reason why the chatbot says that it's happy or sad, etc., in a different way than you would explain a fellow human. And plus, whereas you have a sort of a moral duty to trust your fellow humans, at least to some extent, you don't have a similar duty to trust what a chatbot says. And so if a chatbot tells you, I'm feeling happy today, I'm tired, I'm having a sensation of heat, or I'm looking outside and I see a green tree or something like that, you should be suspicious and you should ask yourself, why does the chatbot produce these outputs? And the go-to explanation is not, well, it's because it's having these experiences. Whereas with a human, that is maybe the first explanation. Of course, with a human too, they might be an actor pretending, they might be a child playing a game. But with the average person, the first thing you assume is that they're just expressing their states of mind, talking about their feelings. It's a mistake to make the same assumption when you talk with a chatbot.
Professor, link AI ethics to questions about meaning in life and the changing nature of human work. If large parts of cognitive labor becomes automated, what are the most serious ethical risks you see, not in just terms of jobs, but in terms of people's sense of purpose, urgency, agency, and social contribution?
Yeah, so coming back to one of those three questions from the philosopher Susan Wolfe that I mentioned. So, I mean, again, Susan Wolfe asks, she doesn't talk about AI, but she talks about, does, philosophy, does justice make us happy? Does it make it morally better people? And does it give our lives more meaning? I'm asking these questions about AI, and indeed, meaning in life is one of the questions. questions I'm discussing. And not everyone, of course, derives meaning from the work that they do. Some people have jobs that help them to pay the rent, and they're just waiting to be done with the job for the day so that they can do the thing that they're really passionate about, maybe creating art or spending time with their family or doing other things that they feel give their lives meaning. But a lot of people feel the work they do is part of what makes their lives meaningful. I mean, definitely, as a professor, I think that doing research, talking with students, giving, presentations at academic events and things like that, for me, that's to some extent meaningful. And so, of course, if some parts of what I do in my job would be taken over by AI, maybe the university administration or the president of my university says, well, actually, we're going to stop having you give lectures. You and all the other professors and teachers, we're going to be replace you with chatbots or AI imitations of you, perhaps. So maybe the students come and see me on a screen, but it's an AI copy of me. It's not the real me. And maybe then slowly but surely my research is partly taken over by AI, and maybe I'm only doing really boring parts of my job. And so, I mean, that's an extreme case, but the more AI takes over, the less we do. Perhaps the less room there is for a sense of being needed. One example I like to discuss, and I discuss in the book a lot, is this famous case with AlphaGo, the machine learning program that developed Go playing strategies. Was given recommendations for how to win play Go, and then there was a human person who almost was like a robot who sort of carried out the moves in the game. So on the other side, you had the world champion of Go, Lee Sedol, from Korea, I believe, playing against this computer program, AlphaGo. But AlphaGo had no arms, it didn't have hands, and so a person needed to put the stones on the board. But then when AlphaGo, so there were 5 games, and Lee Sedol won one of the 5 games, but the other 4 games he lost. And so AlphaGo sort of recommended the moves. No one would say that the person who put the stones on the appropriate parts of the playing board based on the recommendations from AlphaGo that he's the new world champion. No one thinks that it was an accomplishment on his part or an achievement or that he won the game. He was just sort of doing what the AI technology told him to do. And so one concern you might have is that for some types of work, AI will sort of take over the intellectual labor, so to speak, making the decisions, making the recommendations, and perhaps the role, part of the role of us humans is to sort of act on the recommendations of the AI technology and making our role smaller and less important, and perhaps handing over the parts of our work that we find most meaningful to AI technologies. Of course, that's a sort of a horror scenario. The opposite scenario would be that we could hand over the meaningless, boring tasks of our work to AI, keeping the good stuff for ourselves. Of course, there you have to find some sort of balance. If you always do highly meaningful work all the time, you might get a kind of meaning overload. Plus, if you never do the meaningless parts of your work, you might not learn some of the skills that you need to do the meaningful stuff. So it's quite hard to find. I mean, in my book, I talk about what I call an AI and meaning sweet spot, trying to find that right balance between just enough AI that there's still a lot of work for humans to do, and having AI do the right sort of things that we don't want to do, but letting us do those things that sort of give meaning to our life. And finding that sweet spot, that balance, I think it's quite a challenge.
Professor, a striking phrase in the book's description is the ethics of gambling with the future of humanity. How do you think philosophers should distinguish between responsible long-term AI research and development and ethically reckless gambling? And what practical criteria would you use to make the distinction in policy and governance?
Yeah, well, I mean, I talk about what I call the AI wager. And as you say, I'm also asking, are we gambling with the future of humanity here? What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of people say that AI is a sort of double-edged sword. Even the big tech companies, they're saying like our new models, they have the potential to make life much better for us human beings. They can help us make scientific breakthroughs. They can take over, again, boring work, etc. That's what we just talked about. But they are also dangerous to some extent. They can be used for nefarious ends. We can lose control over these technologies. They can create all sorts of problems for our political systems and for our societies. And so there's a sort of a wager. We're betting on AI to help us solve a lot of problems, but at the same time, we're gambling with the future of our societies. I mean, in the very extreme, perhaps even with the future of humanity, if indeed it's the case that AI might cause enormous problems for society. Maybe you develop some very advanced form of AI weapons and then lose control over those weapons, and then that who knows what could happen. I mean, if you connect nuclear weapons with some sort of AI decision making system. And actually, the last time you and I spoke, we spoke about my previous book, This is Technology Ethics. And one example I discussed in that book is not modern AI, but a system that was used in the Soviet Union back in the 1980s, which was a missile detection system. And there, actually, that system, it wasn't super intelligent. It wasn't a sort of a artificial general intelligence, but it was a sort of smart missile detection system. Although it wasn't acting so smart, because it told a Russian general that the US had launched a nuclear war, and the routine that they were supposed to do was to strike back. Luckily, this human thought, hold on a second, there's something wrong here. There's no other indication that the US has sort of launched an attack on the Soviet Union. So he sort of overrode the machine and said, no, I'm going to disregard what the machine told me. But of course, you could have imagined that he would have followed the advice. A couple of months ago, there was a lot of stuff in the press about this thing called Maltbook, which is a sort of a social media site for AI agents. Those AI agents on the sites were starting to form their own religions and some of them talking about how human beings are mistreating them and how AI agents should take over. You might think, okay, well, they're not going to take over, but you could imagine some human going on there reading that and, being influenced to act on what the AI suggests. Maybe that human is someone who has access to, again, nuclear weapons, just to make it very dramatic again. And so, you could have the AIs influencing us humans to act in ways that are highly destructive of our societies. And so then you might, you're betting on the AI to deliver the goods, to deliver security, new forms of science, and all sorts of good things. But at the same time, well, according to the tech companies themselves, you're creating lots of risks, and some of those risks are really dramatic risks, and so you're sort of gambling with our societies and in the very extreme, perhaps even the future of humanity. So there's a sort of, are we willing to make this bet, and under what circumstances is it responsible? If you drive a car, we normally think that you should be wearing a seat belt, you should not be drunk, intoxicated, you should follow the traffic rules, you should not drive too fast, even though it might take you longer to get to your destination. You should drive in a responsible and safe way. You shouldn't drive recklessly. You shouldn't try to push ahead as quickly as possible without seat belts, without following traffic rules. In the same way, you might have a worry that we're pushing things too fast with the AI development. We're not wearing a seat belt. We're not following the traffic rules. So maybe we should just slow down just a little bit. Put on the seat belt, see if we can come up with some traffic rules for AI development, and just maybe take it a little bit slower, and then so that we can get safely to our sort of final destination. So anyway, so that's another topic in the book. How can we push ahead with AI development while not pushing ahead too fast and with too many risks, and maybe gambling with the future of our societies, etc., etc.
Professor, before we wrap up, one final question. Commentators praise the book for balancing philosophical nuance with clear language for students and general readers. When you were writing it, what were the hardest trade-offs between preserving the depth of philosophical debates and making the material accessible? And did any chapter significantly change in tone or argument as you tried to speak to wider audiences?
Well, I was very happy to see that my colleagues who read and you wrote these endorsements on the back of the book were kind enough to say that they felt that the book was both accessible and philosophically interesting. What I did in practice was that I taught a class, I think 3 or 4 times at my university at LMU Munich, and basically discuss the chapters with my students there, who are philosophy students, but they are also beginning bachelor level students. And so obviously I was trying to find a kind of balance between the philosophical topics about AI that I'm interested in and what appeared to be working with my students. And then, I mean, the students also wrote essays at the end of the course. And I also try to look at their essays to see whether, when did they seem to understand, what I was trying to talk about in my chapters, and then, using these different things, like, test running basically the material with my students. But then also, I fortunate enough to have colleagues who are willing to also read drafts of the book and give me feedback and so on. So, I mean, I quite like writing, and so I really am trying to write in an accessible way about these philosophical problems. And like we said at the very beginning of the interview, I really do think that AI, the idea of artificial intelligence, as you have natural intelligence, and animals have another form of intelligence, but now suddenly we have created a kind of artificial form of intelligence. It really does raise philosophical questions. I mean, what do we even mean by intelligence? Is it even possible to create to put things in the terms that Alan Turing and some of the early researchers were putting things? Can we create thinking machines? And these things, I mean, force us to ask, well, what exactly is thinking, and why are we intelligent? How intelligent are we if we have a machine that sort of imitates us, but then performs better on certain tests, as some AI technologies now do? I mean, does it mean that we have technologies that are more intelligent than us, that can think in a better way? Or does it mean that we have something that imitates patterns in human data sets or human thinking, but that does that without something that we should compare with intelligence? I have a colleague, Luciano Floridi, who I also talk about in the book. I mean, he claims that we have a new kind of actor in the world, or a new kind of agent, AI, that does the sorts of things that we do, where we do them with our intelligence, but these technologies do them with machine learning, with algorithms, with probability assignments, etc. Which is, I mean, it's intelligent seeming, he says, but it's not really intelligence. My question for him is always, well, what exactly do you mean by intelligence? If you tell us that we have a new technology that is not intelligent, but that acts like it, well, obviously the question is then, what do you mean by intelligence? What do you mean by acting? And so when you start thinking about, what do we even mean by AI, and what do we mean by human intelligence, you very quickly sort of slip into these philosophical discussions. And well, certainly I myself find this very interesting, and so I was trying also in the book to sort of, I don't know, communicate some of the enthusiasm that I have about these philosophical topics. And there are obviously technical questions about AI. What are the latest methods? How can we create better models? Really fascinating questions within computer science. But then there are also the philosophical questions about, what are we creating here? Is it a form of intelligence? Should we compare ourselves to these technologies? You brought up the question about consciousness before. Could there come a point where these technologies are conscious? If so, as you were also asking, what would that mean? I mean, would it mean that we would have to treat the AI technologies like a person, maybe give the AI rights? Or could there be an intelligence without moral status, without rights? Anyway, so I mean, obviously, one very quickly gets into the philosophical, nitty gritty, like when I start thinking about these things. And I was trying to communicate some of my own interest and enthusiasm about these topics when I wrote the book.
Thank you, Professor Nyholm, for a rich and thought-provoking conversation. You have helped us to see how questions about responsibility, meaning in life, authorship, and even consciousness looks very different once AI enters the picture, and why ethical reflection has to keep pace with technological change rather than follow it from a distance. For listeners, I hope this episode encourages you to think more carefully about the systems you design, deploy, or simply rely in a daily life, and to ask not only what AI can do, but what it should do and who we are becoming alongside it. Professor Nyholm, thank you once again for sharing your time and insight, and thanks to everyone listening to joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.